You think you're thinking with your brain right now. You think your consciousness, your sense of self, your entire experience of being alive is happening inside your skull. But what if you're wrong? What if consciousness isn't produced by your brain at all? What if your brain is just a receiver, like a radio picking up signals from somewhere else entirely? Because there's growing evidence that consciousness might not be what neuroscientists have been telling us it is. And if they're right, then everything we believe about the mind, about the self, about what it means to be human is fundamentally incorrect. You assume that when you damage the brain, you damage consciousness. You assume that when the brain dies, consciousness disappears. These seem like obvious facts, but they might be the biggest misconceptions in all of science. And the implications are staggering. For over a century, neuroscience has operated under a simple assumption: the brain creates consciousness the way the heart pumps blood or the lungs process oxygen. It's a biological function, nothing more. Consciousness emerges from neural activity the way wetness emerges from water molecules. This is called the materialist view of consciousness, and it's starting to crumble. The first crack appeared when scientists realized they couldn't find consciousness anywhere in the brain. They could map every neuron, trace every connection, monitor every chemical reaction. But consciousness itself remained invisible. You can see brain activity. You can measure electrical impulses. You can watch regions light up on brain scans when someone thinks or feels or remembers. But you can't see the actual experience, the subjective feeling of what it's like to be that person. This is what philosophers call the hard problem of consciousness. And it's not just unsolved. It's getting harder. Recent discoveries in neuroscience are revealing that the relationship between brain and consciousness is far stranger than anyone imagined. People with massive brain damage sometimes retain full consciousness. People with intact brains sometimes lose consciousness completely. The correlation between brain function and conscious experience is breaking down. Take the case of hydrocephalus patients who have lost up to 95% of their brain tissue to fluid buildup, yet maintain normal intelligence and consciousness. If consciousness was produced by the brain, this should be impossible. It's like having a car engine with 95% of its parts missing, but still running perfectly. Or consider split brain patients, people who've had the connection between their brain hemispheres severed to treat severe epilepsy. These individuals seem to develop two separate streams of consciousness in the same skull. One brain, two minds. This shouldn't happen if consciousness is unified and brain-generated. Then there are cases of terminal lucidity, where people with severe dementia or brain damage suddenly regain full consciousness and clarity just before death, when their brains are at their most damaged state. If consciousness comes from the brain, this is like a broken radio suddenly receiving perfect signal reception. But perhaps the most disturbing evidence comes from near-death experiences. People who are clinically dead with no measurable brain activity report vivid, coherent experiences. They describe leaving their bodies, seeing events from impossible vantage points, encountering deceased relatives, and returning with information they couldn't have known. Materialist neuroscience dismisses these as hallucinations caused by dying brain cells. But studies are finding that people can accurately describe events that happened while they were clinically dead, information they couldn't have perceived through normal sensory channels. If consciousness is produced by the brain, none of this should be possible. This is where alternative theories of consciousness start to look less like fringe science and more like necessary explanations for impossible data. The transmission theory of consciousness suggests that the brain doesn't generate consciousness, but receives it, like a television antenna picking up broadcasts. From this perspective, brain damage doesn't destroy consciousness, but interferes with its reception and expression. Think about it. When your radio breaks, the radio waves don't disappear. They're still there, but you can't access them. Similarly, when the brain is damaged, consciousness might still exist, but be unable to manifest through the compromised neural machinery. This would explain why consciousness can persist despite massive brain damage. The signal is still there, but the receiver is impaired. It explains terminal lucidity. As the brain dies, perhaps some interference is removed, allowing consciousness to come through more clearly in its final moments. It also explains how psychedelic drugs work. Instead of creating consciousness-altering experiences, they might be changing the brain's receiving capacity, allowing it to access different frequencies of consciousness that are normally filtered out. But if consciousness isn't generated by the brain, where is it coming from? Some theories propose that consciousness is a fundamental property of the universe, like space or time or energy. This view, called panpsychism, suggests that all matter has some degree of consciousness, and complex brains simply organize and amplify this universal consciousness into the coherent experience we recognize as human awareness. From this perspective, you're not a conscious being because you have a brain. You have a brain that's capable of channeling and focusing the consciousness that already exists everywhere in the universe. This isn't mystical speculation. It's being seriously considered by philosophers and scientists because it solves problems that materialist theories cannot address. If consciousness is fundamental, it explains why we can't reduce subjective experience to objective brain states. You can't explain consciousness in terms of simpler components because consciousness is already at the bottom level of reality. It explains why consciousness seems to have causal power, why your thoughts can influence your actions. In materialist theories, consciousness should be just a passive byproduct of brain activity with no real influence. But if consciousness is fundamental, it can genuinely affect physical processes. This connects to cutting-edge research in quantum mechanics, where consciousness might play an active role in determining physical reality. The measurement problem in quantum mechanics suggests that conscious observation might literally collapse quantum possibilities into definite realities. Some interpretations of quantum mechanics propose that consciousness is what transforms the fuzzy probability waves of quantum superposition into the concrete classical world we experience. If this is true, then consciousness isn't just aware of reality, it's actively creating reality moment by moment. But this raises an even more profound possibility. If consciousness is fundamental and plays a role in creating physical reality, then consciousness might exist independently of any physical substrate, including brains. This is where we enter territory that challenges every assumption about the nature of existence itself. Consider the possibility that consciousness is not dependent on matter, but the other way around. What if consciousness is the primary reality and matter, including brains, exists within consciousness rather than consciousness existing within brains? This perspective, sometimes called idealism, suggests that what we call the physical world is actually a manifestation of consciousness, not its source. Your brain doesn't create your mind. Your mind creates your brain, along with everything else you experience as physical reality. From this view, the brain is like a vortex in consciousness, a pattern of activity within the field of awareness that creates the appearance of being a separate physical object. But the vortex isn't separate from the water it occurs in. Similarly, your brain isn't separate from the consciousness it manifests within. This sounds radical, but it's consistent with some interpretations of quantum mechanics and relativity. If space and time are emergent properties rather than fundamental realities, if matter is mostly empty space held together by fields and forces, then perhaps what we call physical reality is far more consciousness-like than we assumed. Recent theories in physics suggest that information, not matter or energy, might be the fundamental constituent of reality. And information requires something to process and experience it. That something might be consciousness itself. If consciousness is the basis of reality rather than its product, it explains why consciousness seems so different from everything else we study scientifically. We can't understand consciousness objectively because consciousness is the subject that makes objectivity possible in the first place. It explains why consciousness can't be found in the brain. We're looking for the projector inside the movie, but consciousness is the screen everything else is projected onto. But if consciousness isn't in your brain, what is your brain actually doing? One possibility is that brains are like focusing devices that concentrate and organize consciousness into coherent patterns of experience. Different brain structures might tune into different aspects of consciousness, creating the rich variety of human experience. The visual cortex doesn't create visual consciousness, but focuses consciousness into visual experiences. The emotional centers don't generate emotions, but allow consciousness to experience itself as feeling. Memory systems don't store consciousness, but help consciousness access its own past states. This would explain why brain damage affects consciousness in specific ways. Damage doesn't destroy aspects of consciousness, but interferes with the brain's ability to focus consciousness into those particular types of experience. It also explains why enhancing brain function through education, meditation, or other practices can expand consciousness. You're not creating more consciousness, but improving your brain's capacity to access and organize the consciousness that already exists. This has profound implications for questions about artificial intelligence and machine consciousness. If consciousness is fundamental rather than emergent from complex computation, then creating conscious machines might require more than just simulating brain activity. You'd need to create systems capable of channeling consciousness, not just processing information. It raises questions about the nature of death. If consciousness exists independently of the brain, then what we call death might be more like changing channels than turning off the television. The consciousness that you might continue in forms we don't yet understand. It challenges our understanding of personal identity. If consciousness is fundamental and brains are temporary focusing devices, then what makes you might not be your particular brain, but your particular pattern of consciousness organization. You might be more like a song than a singer, a pattern that can exist independently of any specific instrument playing it. But perhaps the most transformative implication is what this means for human potential. If consciousness isn't limited by brain biology, then the boundaries of human experience might be far more flexible than we've assumed. Mystical traditions have long claimed that consciousness can expand beyond ordinary limitations, that humans can access forms of awareness that transcend normal waking consciousness. If consciousness is fundamental rather than brain-generated, these claims become scientifically plausible rather than supernatural speculation. Meditation practices that seem to expand consciousness might literally be doing exactly that, training the brain to access broader ranges of the consciousness field. Psychedelic experiences that reveal impossible perspectives might be temporarily reconfiguring the brain's consciousness reception capabilities. Even phenomena like telepathy, precognition, and other forms of extrasensory perception become theoretically possible if consciousness operates independently of brain-generated processes. The brain might normally filter out these capabilities, but under certain conditions, they could break through. This doesn't mean every mystical claim is valid, but it suggests we shouldn't dismiss them purely because they don't fit materialist assumptions about consciousness being brain-generated. The implications for medicine and mental health are equally profound. If consciousness exists independently of the brain, then treating mental illness might require approaches that work with consciousness directly rather than just manipulating brain chemistry. Therapies that engage consciousness through meaning, purpose, spiritual practice, and transcendent experience might be addressing the root level of human psychology in ways that purely biological approaches cannot reach. It suggests that consciousness research should include not just neuroscience, but also the study of meditation, mystical experience, psychedelic states, and other altered states of consciousness. These might provide crucial data about the nature of consciousness that can't be obtained through brain imaging alone. But the most important implication might be personal. If consciousness isn't confined to your brain, then you might be far more than you've been told you are. The materialist view suggests you're nothing but a complex biological machine, that your thoughts and feelings are just electrochemical processes, that your sense of self is an illusion generated by neural activity. When your brain dies, you simply cease to exist. But if consciousness is fundamental, then you're an expression of something far grander and more mysterious. Your consciousness itself, temporarily focused through the lens of a human brain and body, experiencing itself from a unique perspective. Your thoughts aren't just brain states, but movements in the field of consciousness. Your emotions aren't just chemical reactions, but consciousness experiencing different qualities of itself. Your intuitions and insights aren't just random neural firings, but consciousness recognizing patterns and possibilities beyond what the brain can compute. This view suggests that developing consciousness might be more important than just accumulating information or improving brain function. Practices that expand awareness, cultivate wisdom, and deepen understanding of the nature of experience might be accessing the most fundamental level of what you actually are. It means that consciousness research isn't just an academic exercise, but an exploration of the deepest nature of existence itself. Understanding consciousness might be the key to understanding everything else, because everything else might exist within consciousness rather than consciousness existing within everything else. The brain is an incredible instrument, but it might not be the source of who you are. It might be more like a telescope that allows consciousness to observe itself from countless different perspectives across space and time. And if that's true, then the mystery of consciousness isn't just a scientific problem to be solved. It's an invitation to discover what you actually are beneath all the assumptions about mind and matter, subject and object, self and world. Consciousness might not be in your brain. Your brain might be in consciousness. And that changes everything about what it means to be alive, to be aware, and to be human in a universe far stranger and more wonderful than materialist science has dared to imagine. But this raises perhaps the most profound question of all. If consciousness isn't generated by your brain, then what happens to the individual self? What makes you you if consciousness is universal and fundamental? This is where the nature of personal identity becomes deeply mysterious. In the materialist view, you are your brain. Your memories, personality, thoughts, and feelings are all products of neural patterns unique to your particular brain. When that brain dies, you die with it. But if consciousness is fundamental and brains are focusing devices, then personal identity might work very differently. You might be more like a unique pattern or frequency within universal consciousness, a particular way that consciousness organizes itself into the experience of being an individual. Think of it like music. A song isn't the instrument that plays it, but it requires an instrument to be heard. Similarly, you might not be your brain, but you need your brain to express yourself in the physical world. The song exists independently of any particular piano, but each piano will play it with slightly different characteristics. This perspective suggests that what makes you unique isn't your brain matter, but your particular pattern of consciousness organization. Your memories, personality, and individual quirks might be expressions of a deeper pattern that exists at the level of consciousness itself. This has profound implications for understanding psychological continuity through life changes. Your brain is constantly changing. Every cell is replaced over time, neural connections are constantly forming and dissolving, yet you maintain a sense of being the same person. If consciousness is fundamental, this continuity makes perfect sense. The underlying consciousness pattern remains stable even as the physical substrate changes. It also explains phenomena that are difficult for materialist theories to account for. Why do some people report vivid memories of early childhood experiences from before their brains had developed complex memory systems? Why do identical twins with nearly identical brains often develop completely different personalities and interests? If consciousness provides the template and brains are the expression mechanism, these anomalies become explicable. The consciousness pattern might carry information and tendencies that express themselves through whatever brain structure is available. But this leads to an even more startling possibility. If personal identity exists at the level of consciousness rather than brain structure, then consciousness patterns might be able to exist independently of any particular brain. This doesn't necessarily mean consciousness survives death in any traditional sense, but it suggests that the relationship between individual consciousness and brain function might be far more complex than we've assumed. Recent research into consciousness has revealed phenomena that challenge our basic assumptions about the boundaries of individual minds. Studies of shared consciousness experiences, where individuals report accessing each other's thoughts and experiences directly, suggests that consciousness might not be as individually confined as we believe. Experiments with meditation practitioners have found brainwaves can synchronize with others nearby. If consciousness is fundamental, this might represent brains tuning into the same consciousness frequencies. This connects to reports of people experiencing consciousness beyond individual boundaries. Mystics describe universal consciousness states. Even ordinary people experience expanded awareness. If consciousness is fundamental and brains are focusing devices, these might be glimpses of consciousness operating beyond neural constraints. This has implications for mental illness. Many psychological problems might stem from disruptions in consciousness-brain connection. Throughout history, individuals have demonstrated capacities that exceed brain-generated consciousness. Mathematical prodigies, artistic geniuses, scientific visionaries. If consciousness is fundamental, then developing consciousness becomes the most important thing you can do. The brain is extraordinary, but it might not be the source of what makes you extraordinary. Consciousness might not be in your brain. Your brain might be consciousness exploring what it means to be human.